welcome everyone to UTS today. This American pollster, Frank Luntz, said it's not what you say, it's what they hear. That's an important political principle and underlines our discussion today, all the more so because, as Rebecca's reminded me, he was the advisor to the Bush administration who said one key to managing this issue is to lay off references to global warming and talk instead the softer language of climate change. It's more benign. We're not facing global warming, we're facing climate change. It might be good, it might be bad. There's still scientific debate, all that was implied. So this is part of the challenge that we're going to pick over today. What is the language? What's the importance of language? What have we got wrong in the language we've used to discuss this? What might work? And I'm delighted to have participants in the panel with the experience of the two I have up here on the stage. Rebecca Huntley would be described as one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. Her background's in publishing, university and politics. She has a PhD in gender studies. She studied law and film studies. She currently heads Vox Populi Research as part of the Circa Research Group. She's published, still lucky, why you should feel optimistic about Australia and its people. Australia Fair, Listen to the Nation, which was the first quarterly essay for 2019. She's got a new book coming out in 2019 on climate change and emotion. She's been a broadcaster as well. And John Connor has got an interesting background, a very interesting background. He headed the Climate Institute, and they had money from philanthropic sources, and their work seemed to point, before the 2007 federal election and when the Howard government had a strong commitment to carbon pricing, seemed to point to a fairly settled consensus on what Australia had to do and how we'd go about pricing carbon. He's had 25 years experience working on public and business policy, in fact, with a focus on climate, sustainability and development issues. And fascinatingly, has had 2 years experience in Fiji, working on the COP23 Presidency Secretariat. And as he reminded me recently, it's not a theoretical issue for communities in Fiji. The ocean is rising, they see it, it's a fact of life. John, I'll start with you. What have we got wrong, looking at your experience with the Climate Institute and Australia failing to reach a consensus, failing to deliver on a simple, elegantly simple carbon pricing scheme? What have we got wrong when it comes to the communication of this disaster of climate? What have we got wrong about the language?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bob, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. Thanks, Stuart. Yes, it's been quite a journey. I've been doing this probably for almost 30 years now. I think probably the addendum to make to Frank Luntz's comment is whether they're prepared to hear it all. And so this is where I will start and perhaps finish on it's the political economy, stupid. We can talk about framing and that as much as we like, but language and words do matter, and so it is important. 2007 was fascinating, and in some ways some parallels to now, and we tracked at the Climate Institute attitudes, and we did that through the following 10 years, and the Australia Institute has now picked that up in Climate of the Nation series of attitudinal surveys. I think we had you and Ipsos at one stage, Rebecca, involved in that. 2007 was interesting because it mattered to people locally. It was because it was then when we had the bushfires on the rims of the capital city. It's when we had water shortages in capital cities. We also had a sense of its time in terms of the politics and the need for a change, and a beginning of some awareness that the technological solutions were available. We were beginning to see and could actually touch and feel the solar panels. Electric cars were still a little bit theoretical at that time. But in with the tackling of those issues and its time factor, we had Kevin Rudd elected, who talked about it, framed it as both a moral and an economic issue. Remembered more for the moral framing, but he did try and characterise it as an economic issue. And we saw in fact, concern around climate change actually dipped after 2007, after the election. People had thought they'd elected a government that was going to deal with it. And then we had a very long and drawn out negotiation process and consultation process, which focused on the elegant economic mechanism, which didn't really mean much to the punter in the street. That then came a gutser with the GFC, and so short-term economic issues came about. When we did get with Julia Gillard and the miraculous triangulation with the Greens and the country independence, because that was a really important factor in terms of the politics of that, we had various problems with that, let alone claims before the election of Julia Gillard. But the core element in terms of communicating this, I think, was that when we were trying to sell the carbon pricing mechanism then, was that we led with the glass jaw. We led with the price on pollution, and we didn't talk about the benefits. Even when we actually realised in that elegant package, that 50% of which was household assistance, when they advertised the household assistance, they forgot to tell people that was actually coming from this initiative around carbon and clean energy. So it was a shocking example of that. And then, not to point fingers at everyone else, because we were involved in the blooper reel as well. We as a climate industry, we worked to get a big strategic political alliance together, and we had a coalition from Greenpeace through to the ACTU, which was quite a challenge, particularly at that time. We thought, okay, let's pool our efforts and let's communicate together and run advertising campaign. Part of the problem was we started when we focused on the price on pollution. That sounded like pop. It sounded like that was something fun and fizz. But we also walked into the Murdoch quagmire by, we had an advertising campaign, and the advertiser says, look, let's have Kate Blanchett, it's wonderful, great appeal. And I was going, oh, I'm not sure about that. But look, we've got Michael Caton. We lent out Michael Caton for an exclusive with the Telegraph, they completely went past the Michael Caton and went straight for Carbon Kate on the front page, if some of you mentioned that. So it got then framed as a wealthy person's issue about how we could deal with that. So that's some of the issues with which we came into problems. But the main message is that we've got to do better on selling the benefits of the transition and explain to people the jobs, the benefits and the local climate costs that they can avoid.
Well, you know public opinion. What's,
Most
Rebecca,
of the time.
what stands out for you with what mistakes were made in communicating to that electorate out there, the scale of the problem, and as I said earlier, the elegant simplicity of a price on carbon to get the transition underway?
Yeah, I suppose before I get to that, I just want to make the point that no matter how well we nail the language, if we have climate deniers in major political parties and we have a relentless campaign in media sowing seeds of doubt about climate, there's only so much we can do. So, I mean, as much as the environment movement may have made some errors, those are enormous barriers to face and obstacles to face, which also includes the amount of money that fossil fuel companies give to major political parties. So and then the other thing, the more and more I learn about our psychological response to climate change, is that it is really unlike any other threat we've faced. Even the kind of the parallel of nuclear war, we could at least see the nuclear warheads. So much of what we see in terms of the impacts of climate change can be potentially to people explained as something else. I'll give you an example. I was doing some focus groups just a couple of weeks ago, and with people we would describe as vaguely concerned, cautiously concerned, or we would say doubtful. So the climate movement should mainly focus their attention on those people rather than focusing on making the concerned alarmed, because there's quite a lot of alarmed people out there. I'm one of them. But we really need to shift that group for whom climate is something that they would say they're concerned about in a survey, but for a whole range of reasons aren't thinking about when they're voting. And we were asking these people about whether they saw a connection between climate and the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef. And a lot of them said, oh, it could be climate or it could be the tourism, and they're throwing the plastic straws into the reef, and that could be what's also destroying the reef. It also made me realise how difficult it is to talk about climate issues when there are other environmental issues that are there. And as much as I'm very excited about the fact that we're dealing with plastics pollution, I can't tell you how many focus groups I do where people say, well, I don't use single plastic bags anymore, and that must be helping climate change. And that is really, it's a really challenging and difficult thing. So I think I am constantly, I would say, torn in two. When I look at the research on this, on one level, I've just been involved in a very, very big study for the ABC called Australia Talks, which found that 72% of the community believe that climate change is their biggest personal issue. That is enormously exciting for me. Not a general issue, not something they think government should, we can all say I think the government should be doing more on X. When given a list of issues like terrorism, immigration, they chose climate. The further you go out from a metropolitan city, the less likely you are to be somebody who puts that there. The more likely you are to come from a migrant background, Chinese or Indian, the less likely you are to do that. There's a reason for that. It's a lot of the people in the climate movement are white. And we do not see the diversity of the Australian community represented in the leadership of the climate movement. But I tell you what, the people who are feeling climate change around the world, a lot of them are not white. And in Australia, the community that's feeling climate the most are the people of the Torres Strait. We talk a lot about the farmers, and they are dealing with a lot, but the people of the Torres Strait are dealing with those issues, as John would know as much as anybody else.
Describe what you've seen in the Torres Strait. What stands out?
Well, when I went to the climate reality training earlier on this year, and the greatest climate communicators I've ever seen are the men and women of the Torres Strait. And I'll explain very briefly what they said to me, and then I'll explain to you how we respond to climate is so much about our personal identity and not our understanding of the science. A man got up, a guy called Fred Gieler, who's a mayor of Torres Strait, and he showed us two images, and one was an image of them having to rebury their elders, of which they have no cultural protocols because of climate change. And then there was another image where they were showing trees basically being washed into the water. These are trees that when you're born in the Torres Strait, the afterbirth is taken, it's buried, a tree is planted, and that you are the custodian of that tree. So it was an extraordinary image of intergenerational cultural and social destruction. I went a couple of months afterwards to a writers' festival, and pretty much everybody at a writers' festival was about over 55 and white. And I told this story, and when I told the story about the elders having to rebuild their elders, the whole room went, and then when I told the story about the trees, they're like, yeah. They just didn't react to the tree story at all, but the elders really affected them. Then a couple of days later, I was talking to a whole lot of women my age at the schoolyard about this story. The elders part of it didn't respond. The trees, the trees with the children. And it made me realise that you respond to climate change according to your personal value set, into the things that matter to you. And these are both audiences who care about climate change, scientifically literate, but their emotional response absolutely varied compared to where they were, who they were as individuals. And of course, that makes it a very challenging issue to communicate.
Now, just in passing, valid point made about the white or European background leadership of the environmental movement. I should say we've got Chris Gambian here, the new executive of the
We're going to make Chris stand up.
Stand up, Chris, and wave. Chris is one proud of proud of his Indian subcontinent heritage. More relevantly, he's the new, what's the title? Executive Director of the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales, which, going back a long time, has been the principal umbrella organisation for environmentalism in this state. So I'm sure Chris later will have something to say or a question to throw at us. Would you say, John, thinking of that 70% figure, that there is widespread acknowledgement that the climate is warming, but it is a bit shallow?
Yes, it's broad, but it's shallow. And I was talking to a senior Liberal Party member after the election, and he said, oh, this stuff about this was a climate change election and whatever, and yes, I saw all those polls. It's high on the concerns and whatever. When you ask them and you put a list in front of people and ask them, and it was climate change was there, yes, they responded. When we asked them what were their concerns, to tell us without any list, climate didn't come up. So it goes to the peril sometimes of the methodology of some of these practices.
Absolutely. Yeah.
May I say, with the greatest respect, but it's I think that was it was really powerful. And very smug about that. He was too.
The people you've seen you've heard of in focus groups, what's their response to the action by students in recent weeks? The strikes, the demonstrations, a lot of hostility, of course, whipped up by the News Corp media and by radio figures like Alan Jones. How's the public judge a student strike, students walking out of schools on this issue?
Yeah, I actually think that, again, the way you see that very much depends on how you're already sitting on climate. But I think something like the student strikes has the ability to make people who don't think much about it think about it a little bit more, because it's something different. And in that way, I probably would distinguish it from Extinction Rebellion, because one of the things about Extinction Rebellion, and I'm there in terms of as alarmed and concerned and wanting to find other ways to communicate these issues. There's a kind of Extinction Rebellion's aim is to disrupt. So disrupt, stop things happening, shut things down. And for people who aren't already on the same page around climate, that just makes them more and more anxious. So even the word disruption is one that's upsetting to people and kind of makes some people respond. The kids' climate strike is a bit different. I think in some ways what I've found in groups is that people, again, who are in that kind of bit cautious, bit worrying, kind of think, well, these are kids actually expressing a concern about the future, and so maybe we should be listening to them. I think the critical thing is, what are the conversations being had at home in and around this? Your kids might go off to the strike. Are they coming home and having a conversation? And one of the interesting studies, it was an extensive study done in America to measure the extent to which, if kids are taught about climate change at school and go home and talk to their parents, does it impact their parents? And they found that girls talking to conservative fathers about climate at the table had something like it increased fathers' concern about climate or belief in climate or support for mitigation 3 times, more than anybody else. There's something about teenage girls getting through to conservative fathers. So I think that the children's climate strike, if it leads to really intimate and interesting conversations amongst people we trust about what happens, what's important, what matters to me, then I think it can be really effective, really effective.
Yeah, it must be having some effect on the way big business fathers view this problem, because there is, and this is precisely the area UTS has engaged me on, business and climate, there is a spectacular shift when it comes to boardroom attitudes. You see the recent comments by McKenzie, the CEO of BHP. You see the comments by the heads of insurance companies. None of the 4 big banks in Australia is putting money into thermal coal. None of them were prepared to put a cent into Adani. And I sense that it's not only legal advice on directors' responsibility, not only pressure from shareholders, not only pressure from other investors like the superannuation funds who've elevated this, but it must be people like CEO McKenzie, BHP, thinking of what their children are saying. This must be a pattern. in all those houses in Mossman and Bellevue Hill where the members of boards live, there must be dinner table conversations of the kind you've described. Would you say this is one factor? I mean, you've had to talk to business a lot.
Yeah. Look, it is a factor, and I heard the head of Shell globally talking about how terrified he was for his own daughter's future, and I don't want to be responsible for that, and trying to manage the investment decisions around that. So it's a factor. I do think, and I think I was just saying before, and I enjoyed stepping out of the Australian climate policy debate for a couple of years to go to Fiji, and came back. I left Fiji the night of the election, and I thought I was coming back to a different body politic, but I may have not got my risk management correct on that one. But what I think is really interesting, and I do think it's actually probably more dominant than even their daughters talking to them, is their investors talking to them, is the fact that we've got prudential and financial regulators worried about financial stability, and is quite frankly the fact that there's individual directors' legal liability now being raised with them. Just a short anecdote, I literally have just come from a lunch with a range of senior businesses and a visiting oil chief economist, and he was also saying, and I thought this was fascinating, they're looking at their investment decision making they know about the science, they know we've got to get to net zero emissions, they completely accept that, and they know we're on the wrong trajectory. We're heading 2% increase per year, but there's 400 million cars a year, just in a year, it's an increase. But he's saying our investments...
Sorry, an increase of 400 million cars a
Yes,
year.
the 2% globally of emissions. So we've actually sort of flatlined for a couple of years, global emissions, and we've just started to increase again, and it's increased 2% last year. And he said that's the equivalent of about 400 million cars.
Equivalent of 400 million cars.
Just the additional increase.
Yep.
But what was interesting to me was he said, we know this is happening, and we are concerned about the transition, because we know that if we still stay on that arc, then in 10 years' time, policymakers and others are going to be forced into nationalising petrochemical companies. We're going to have to ban cars. We're going to have to do a whole range of things in which all of our investment decisions will be thrown asunder. Now, so I think there are some of this forward thinking that's going on there.
He's an economist for an oil major, and he's contemplating that if this is real, if the projections are confirmed, any government will be obliged to take harsh measures against that industry sector.
Correct. And we've got investors looking at that as well. There's a very interesting project called the Inevitable Policy Response Project, which the UNPRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, are undertaking right now. And they're looking at exactly that. And they're looking at that in the context of the Paris Agreement process, which does bring us back to the part of the genius of the Paris Agreement is that every 5 years, countries are brought back to the table. And they're doing a lot of work thinking that the next phase with the 2023 global stocktake and the next targets in 2025 will see a major realignment. And so that's another interesting dynamic at play.
What do you say about the shift in opinion from corporate leadership?
Yeah, it's marked, and it's interesting to me, given the kind of corporate speaking I do and kind of conferences I do, how often it comes up. And the other thing that's interested me is how much other speakers, particularly economists on the circuit, say you'll get up and you'll speak at a conference, and out of the 10 questions you get asked, 6 of them will be around climate and risk. And I think that's absolutely happening. And of course, also the insurance agency, an unlikely white knight in this sense, in terms of talking about, my husband's in the building industry, about that kind of, are they going to be building things that are essentially uninsurable, especially when they think about building things in 50, 60, 70 years' time, which is what they do with a lot of infrastructure. So there has been that shift, but I think one of the other things that business leaders, and I'm sure you get this too, John, will say is that there's only so much they can do without the policy framework there. And what is interesting to me is the extent to which I don't quite understand enough about politicians to know why the kinds of the people that they would normally listen to in industry and investment, and even too in the churches who are raising these kinds of issues, that they don't seem to be having the kind of response that you would normally think you'd get from politicians if you've got all of those people lined up talking about this as something that they're actively factoring into their business decision making, but also say in order for it to be fully effective, we need some certainty from you in terms of policy settings and your vision about this.
The price of energy has gone up, of course. Every household is aware of it. Primarily, I think it's true to say, because of a huge investment required to keep the system operating, to render the grid more robust, and with the pressure of old power plants running out. But it has tangled the argument, hasn't it? Because people are being hurt by higher and higher power bills, and it makes it hard for politicians to stand up and say, we are going to price carbon because that's the way of growing these new renewable providers of electricity.
Yeah, well, in fact, it's Chris Dunstan here from ISF has long pointed to the fact that actually the biggest impact on the costs was actually the poles and wires.
Yeah.
And we had, as part of the many sliding door moments and misfortunes, was that we actually went smack back and bang into that as the carbon pricing mechanism started. And John's nodding furiously as well, because knows only too well and that then got portrayed as all the carbon prices' fault. So that was a significant problem. So this power price argument, it's an important one. It obviously matters, particularly for poor households, and that's why the packages that you build around that are really important. But again, come back to the communication, and we sort of see grade A bad communication on this issue today in the front page of the Herald with the IMF report, talking about we need $75 or $111 carbon prices, and that to avoid 2 degrees, and that will mean 75 or 50% increases in power prices. So I went back and looked at the original document, and they set that out, and then they go to, that's to avoid all these terrible things, X, Y, and Z, and of course, how much of X, Y, and Z got reported in that article in the paper today? Big round number.
I mean, the interesting thing is that when you do ask people, do they imagine, regardless of what happens with our energy source, will energy prices go up in the future? They always assume they're going to go up, right? It's people
are tolerance threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. So they absolutely think that even if we keep our energy mix exactly the same as the way it is now, it will continue to go up. So they're not unrealistic about that. But I think one of the things that is the big question for them is, well, how much burden should individual houses pay for that transition? Is government policy stable? Is whatever change that's going to happen in our energy mix are the energy companies going to flagrantly use that change to get more money out of us? So the immediate impulse is they're thinking that the energy companies are going to use whatever happens in terms of a transition to cleaner energy as an opportunity to make more money out of them. So it's muddy. The waters are muddied there. Mainly people want that transition to renewable energy to happen quickly, but they question whether the energy companies and government will do it in a way that doesn't actually smack households even more than they're already being smacked.
If I were a federal minister or a state premier, what would be the best way of selling to the electorate? There's going to be a spike in your electricity bills because we're going to be allowing to close an old-fashioned behemoth of a coal-fired reactor.
Wow. I think one of the things, I think that politicians are going to have to need a group of people around them to communicate that question. You know, you actually do need the energy companies to stand with you at that time. I mean, you can't because politicians aren't necessarily the great mouthpieces for public sacrifice at the moment. It falls very badly off their mouth. This is a short-term sacrifice for a long-term gain. We're at a point of such anger and disengagement with politics, it's very difficult. I think, again, if you're thinking about kind of fundamentals of communication, you need to talk about how you protect the most vulnerable, the people for whom, and what the plan is, and also this idea, I think, of a community coming together to make something happen. We've managed to do it in the past on water, absolutely in ways that while it was still difficult, where we've seen people feel like the saving of water and the use of water, which requires a certain amount of behavioural sacrifice at least, was something that was a community concern and everybody was going to band together to do something about it. So we have been able to do it. Energy just seems a lot hard, maybe because the prices are higher and because it's been much more politicised. But there is a way to say, if we all band together in this short period of time, the outcome will be better for everybody. But it's a difficult task.
Well, I think that's definitely the case. It's selling the benefits. And so it's corny, but literally I was at my son's rugby game during amongst all of that, and a fellow next to me said, I don't mind paying a bit more, but I want to know what I'm going to get.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's that sense of what are we going to achieve, and there are great stories. And it's also important to remember we're not just talking about energy. I mean, it is the dominant thing which we need to get right, but there are other industrial elements or other things amongst my membership now of the Carbon Market Institute, offset providers, changing agricultural practices, actually revegetating landscapes and getting carbon benefits out of that. It was a whole host of regional employment benefits, Indigenous communities getting cash flows. There's some extraordinary range of stories. So I think it's important to make sure all those stories, and that's
But Rebecca, you've warned that talking about benefits in terms of someone on the roof installing a solar panel doesn't work because people don't see that as a durable new job.
Yeah, no, I was really interested again in this recent research I was doing. People were talking about, and this is particularly the case in, I would say, in Queensland and in regional Australia, when you start talking about transition away from coal, people think about job losses. And one of the tricky things I sometimes do is, how many people do you think are employed in coal in Australia versus how many people in industries, either in renewables or sustained by renewables? And there's many, many more people in coal. You present the actual figures. And what they'll actually say is those renewable jobs aren't as good as those. Even though there's more of them and they're rising, they're not as good. They're not real jobs like being in mining. They don't pay as well, they're not as secure. And then you're going to think, well, when you think of who is in the getting a job out of renewable energy, they think of a guy with a truck installing solar panels. And they often say, well, once the solar panels are installed, what do they do? So one of the things I think we absolutely need to do is show all of those concentric circles that come out of, and the industries that are capable of being suddenly viable if you have cheaper energy. And so that's obviously a big task but it's a cultural and social imagining of what are the jobs that are worth having and the jobs that we value and the jobs that we see as sustaining communities. And that is very much one of imagery and language and lots of examples, as you've mentioned, John, that have to be out there.
Yeah, I'm not passing over this quickly because I think it is a huge difficulty. I'm not sure whether we've got the solution, but how you spell out the benefits of climate action is real. How do you win a political argument? I think with, as you say, John, with a host of examples, but Rebecca's warning that too many people seem to think that the only benefit's going to be someone crawling around their roof installing a solar panel, and they don't, rightly or wrongly, they don't see that as enduring or significant. So I think we are going to need to return to that. Let's challenge ourselves with a really big problem, another really big problem, and that's what you referred to in shorthand as the transition. For people who are employed in one of the great coal-fired power stations, a community dependent on those jobs, Central Coast, Hunter Valley, or a coalfields community like that in the Hunter, or in central Queensland. I was advised by Mark Murray, the Secretary of Unions New South Wales, that the word transition is not very welcome in these communities. And he said there are people who've got jobs in the coal industry, talking generally about open cut mines, driving a track, very well paid and secure jobs, skilled jobs, who don't like the idea of a transition. They'd rather stick at that job for a likely 10 more years than to be recruited for some new job that might be durable to the end of their working lives. And in their shoes, who can blame them? They're used to driving that truck in the open cut, around the open cut pit, and they like it, and the conditions are good and the pay's good. Why would they want to put their hand up for retraining towards a job in wine-based tourism or working for national disability? Is there an alternative? And the word transition, I'm advised, has got all these connotations for them.
It really does.
What do you think?
Look, it's a tough one, isn't it? And I think what's important, of course, for those workers, they've also got support networks like the unions and other communities, as well as the higher pay for some of those positions. But it's why we do need to have that inclusive approach and to talk with the unions and the community groups about a just transition. Maybe we need to supplement that about regional resilience and actually talking about so that you actually got their kids have got a future job as well, because many of those workers know that their kids may not have jobs in those ones. They might want to say, crikey, keep me going in this for as long as I can. For God's sake, don't make me be a park ranger or something. Some of us might like, but won't pay as well. But give me something what I can look forward to for my kids as well.
So a message about economic diversification leading to more resilient local economies.
Exactly, and I think, it's also it's incumbent on the unions. It's incumbent on the social groups, and they've actually been very good. And I've worked with them in many of these, but also on governments to set up some of the frameworks, transition authorities, transition frameworks, call them whatever else you want, regional resilience frameworks or whatever, to attend to those issues.
Yeah, and look, I mean, let's face it, a big part of that workforce is men, and whenever I've gone to particularly parts of regional Australia, and actually often the focus groups that I'd be doing are with the women who are married to these men, and they're men who might have lost their job or they were fly-in, fly-out workers, which was destructive, and now they've come back and they're tooling around the house, they're in the shed. She's gone back to full-time work because, thank God, she's got a job in local government or in the bank. And it's triggered real family problems, problems in the marriage, problems with his depression, and it would be a very kind of, those kinds of stories get around. And when you think about, and you can understand, if I can go full pelt at this for the next 10 years and maybe this job won't be there, but at least all of the other things, my status, my sense of self and the way that my family runs stays intact. And we also have to acknowledge that, the Australian economy has gone through a series of transitions that have been extremely beneficial to our economy, but have brought about some change, and some people haven't bounced back. So people assume that when you're talking about transition, that there will be losers in the same way that have been in previously, perhaps even worse. So it is a really difficult thing to talk about in those communities, and it's why I often find talking about climate change in those communities is actually fundamentally different to talking about it in outer suburban areas, because for them, as long as they want a transition to renewable energy, as long as they don't have to pay that much more, they don't have, I suppose, a cultural or patriotic or attachment to the coal industry in the way that you often do in those regional areas, including in Queensland, which is very difficult to talk about.
What are some of the, getting back to the broader question of communicating about the reality of climate change, over the middle of this year, the northern summer, you've had record-breaking temperatures in Europe, undeniable. You've had them here as well. You've had fires in the Amazon, fires in Siberia, evidence of the melting of permafrost, releasing an almost toxic greenhouse gas, worse than carbon dioxide. Persistent reports about the loss of ice cover. Which of these, and drought conditions in Australia, which of these are most potent in shifting opinion, getting people to say, climate, now that you nominate it, climate is my biggest concern. What's your experience in looking at in testing arguments, which you do in focus groups?
Yeah.
You test arguments. What really shifts people?
Look, one of the things I'm thinking that happens more, I mean, as much as we love polar bears, it's been a very overused image. I was actually talking to a climate activist in the Philippines, and she said all of the global information that she gets that global climate communicators think that she can use in the Philippines have these polar bears in them. And she said that is not the face of climate change in the Philippines. I think one of the things, and I alluded to this a bit in my quarterly essay, I think we're getting very close to this idea of climate change impacting the great Australian way of life, which is that summers are times of, well, for you, reading books, and for other people, being at the beach and kind of being relaxed.
You've seen me at
No,
the
for no.
I have.
Oh yeah, for me,
Very impressive.
it's toiling inside, working on my next book. But this kind of idea of this Australian summer of relaxation and connecting with friends and being outdoors, that is sliding away from people, and you don't have to talk about a permafrost to think that that is a real concern, and that you've got to keep your pets indoors or they're going to die, and then grandma, you've got to check on grandma more because she can't
Hotter
afford
and hotter summers.
those kinds
People
of
have
hot
grasped
summers.
the point,
Yeah.
yeah, hotter and hotter summers affecting our capacity to be outdoors enjoying nature.
Exactly. So the opposite of relaxation, actual tension. And the other, I remember, this is why I love focus groups. I was talking to, in this groups a couple of weeks ago, one woman said, I'm really worried about climate change and people get really, really cranky when they're hot, and there's going to be more arguments. Like there's actually going to be more civil unhappiness. And she says, and thank God we don't have guns, because more American, the hotter it is, more Americans are going to shoot each other. And it's not a joke. There's actually quite a lot of study done about the increase in violence in America. I would shoot my whole family dead if they didn't put the air conditioning on hot nights, because everybody argues about whether you have it on or not. So I think people are getting that. So instead of talking about future and talking about what's happening in the world, you actually have lots of rich material to talk about the kinds of things people value about why we live in this country and what's under threat, and they can sense it. They can see hints of it as every summer, and it's a real opportunity to talk about action.
Tell us that little case study you came across in America about getting politically conservative birders, birdwatchers, to act on climate.
Yeah, this is, there's a society in America that's over 100 years old called the Oberdon Society. It's a bird watching society. Anybody a bird watcher in the room? Or no bird watchers? They're very unique they're unique human beings. And I did a long interview with the campaign and advocacy manager for the organisation, the umbrella organisation, trying to get Conservatives to act on climate. They did a lot of research which found that Conservatives didn't like the language of responsibility around climate. You're responsible for climate change, because they took personal responsibility incredibly important. It was a central tenet of their worldview. The other thing they didn't like is projecting too much into the future. So what they managed to do, and I thought this was very clever, and provides a bit of a template for how you talk to people who don't have a progressive mindset on climate, is they said to them, what matters to you? It was easy because they were bird watchers, because the things that mattered to them most was their local bird. Not the bald eagle, but the bird from their state, which is often the mascot for their football team. And over 50% of the local birds, like the state birds in America, are threatened, mainly by habitat destruction, but also about changing weather and climate change. So they kind of said, we know you care about this bird, we know you want to continue to watch it. And what they did, I thought was clever, is they tried to find a way to talk lightly about the scientific aspects of climate change and avoid too much talking about the future projection, too much talking about the language of personal responsibility, the kind of script that we're so used to with climate. And then they said, but we want you to act. We need you to go and write letters, meet people, talk to them about not destroying habitat, and a whole range of the usual climate change mitigation strategies. And they were enormously successful. And I think they did that because they realised that to confront these people's conservative mindset and conservative identity, and all of it with the usual script around climate change, wasn't going to work. But you could start with the thing that they really valued, which was local and small and very personal, and you could get them to act and do things that really were quite extraordinary and surprised this group. The one thing you couldn't get them to do is share anything on social media. And I think that was really critical, because they knew that if you kind of are putting all this stuff out on Facebook and your friendship group is conservative, then you're also, then people don't want to do that. So I think it was a really effective way for us to think really seriously about who are we talking to about climate change? What are the things that matter to them? What are their values? How much do we need to talk to them about climate to get them to act? And if we have to tread lightly through that pathway that we're all on, but we're still getting to the act, does it really matter that they buy or don't buy, that in 10 years this is how the world's going to be? It probably doesn't, if we can get them to do the things we need to get them to do.
Yeah, so that case study is very relevant to reaching out to conservative inclined voters, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's possible. I think what we've had, as John, both of you know, is kind of 30 years of the politicisation, or at least 20 years of the political polarisation around climate. And the two things that are worrying me at the moment about the climate discussion is the extent to which people are blurring plastics recycling and climate. That is infuriating me, but hopefully that will go by the by.
Well, the Prime Minister seemed to feed it the other day.
He
I think he made a comment to the effect, this is a more important or more immediate problem, plastics in the ocean, instead of climate. Just pointing towards the future, I want to test.
Oh, what was the second thing? The second thing is the big message I'm getting from all my research at the moment is when we put the usual climate change script, this is what emissions are, we have to stop them in 10 years, is these groups of voters that I'm particularly interested in, the cautious and the disengaged and the doubtful, is they say, oh, we've heard this all before. They're actually bored of the story.
Yeah.
So, and it might be just a defensive mechanism, but we need new ways into this conversation for that group that feel jaded about that message. And in fact, the more you yell that message at them, the more they turn away.
Well, that's very important. Can I ask two of you to just advise on two other approaches to the future? You've now got business setting the pace, business innovation, business a long way ahead of Canberra, it seems. Those boards, insurance companies, BHP Rio, the miners, the big miners, the banks I quoted earlier, they're all more explicit than ministers in the Canberra government, although you've got to say coalition governments at the state level have been quite bold in signing up to emissions reduction targets, as if they've got a different set of priorities. But is there the prospect in Canberra of having both sides gravitate towards the centre, based on what business is doing? Again, this is a bit of my focus here at UTS, business and climate. But all these initiatives from business, like Woolworths that I visited recently in Preston's, they're proud that their big store there, like their other stores, is becoming carbon neutral. Solar panels on the roof and a new natural refrigerant, given that all refrigerants leak. So we're going to have a natural one that does not represent a big contribution to greenhouse gas. Instead of Labor becoming focused on the 45% target, take the advice of Ross Garnaut, who told me that we're going to reach the 45% target by 2030 as a result of business initiatives. Is there a centre ground here based on business-led innovation happening faster than the economy that enables people to debate instead how it happens, what battery storage, what interconnectors we need to do to see that the renewables, in which there's a massive investment, generate power that flows comfortably through our complex grid?
How do we navigate out of the trenches we're stuck in right now?
Exactly. Exactly.
It's a big question that's obviously played on all of our minds. Look, I think it's still very complex right now, but I do think perhaps a sectoral approach will help because it actually makes it concrete. I mean, we have talked about these elegant economy-wide mechanisms, and I do fundamentally still believe we need to have them, and perhaps more though as a backstop, and also because of the urgency of the change. I mean, let's not forget with the sorts of impacts that we're having right now at 1 degree of warming, they're going to continue to escalate, and those impacts will drive a lot more community unrest and the actual the impacts. So there's actually only a certain amount. So we do need there's no way I think an elegant carbon pricing mechanism is going to generate the prices that we need. We need to have sectoral policies on top of that, and that may actually be a way forward. In fact. This government has committed, pre and post the election, and did so at the Pacific Forum, to a 2050 strategy. They're asked to do so under the Paris Agreement as well. And that may be an opportunity to have and I've put this to the government, and to encourage sectors to come forward with their decarbonisation strategies. What does that mean? We're actually seeing there's a rare chink of light around hydrogen. Everyone seems to like hydrogen.
Yeah.
So how do we find some of those other conversations that we see? We did think we'd have that around electric cars, but God knows how that got so complicated during the election. But there are other areas which we are seeing which can actually fuel and provide some sort of visual keys for the community as well about ways forward. So I think that's important. I really do think the financial regulators, so we're seeing old 55-year-old plus white males freaking out about financial stability and raising these questions. And so much of this is tribal. And when they're seeing these people who they see from their tribe in the financial sector ringing the bell, that changes the debate. And I think we need to encourage more of that focus as well.
No, I agree. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in the research I conduct is how people respond to language around emergency and threat and urgency. And I think that some people get it, like everybody in this room, we feel alarmed. People who are concerned feel that sense of that we have to act because of what the scientists are telling us. But I think there's an opportunity around the economic opportunity that could be lost if we don't act. I think people get that. This is where the world, not only our region, but the world is going. This is where the money is moving. And we will be left behind if we don't. And we will also pay a penalty. So that's a complex story that not just politicians can tell, but lots of business leaders can, from everything from small business to larger business, of that lost opportunity. And people get that story better because that still talks about not what might happen in 10 or 20 years, but something slipping away from us right now.
So we've spoken about opinion polls, broad quantitative opinion polls, and the focus groups that give you a bit of quality, tests arguments, gets feedback, like the fascinating feedback from the woman you mentioned. The hot temperatures are going to leave us all cranky and ready to reach for our guns. There's no way you could have made that up. It had to emerge in a focus group.
No, that's right.
But what about deliberative assemblies? They did get a bit of a run in 2009, testing worldwide views on global warming. The notion being you have 100 randomly selected citizens deliberate for 2 days. So call that deliberative democracy, to test arguments, to see what people would accept, and the common sense of average voters, non-specialists, can be very, very helpful. A deliberative assembly is a new approach to assessing public opinion, getting advice for government. Now, I acknowledge straight away that when Julia Gillard suggested that as a climate initiative in the unhappy 2010 election, the result was entirely negative. But new approaches to democracy sometimes get canvassed. Would it play a part at this stage in the climate debate in Australia?
Look, I responded then. Actually, I think we've got to try new approaches about engaging these issues and informing the debate. And but if they're not seriously plugged in, then they're really not worth the paper that they're written on. I think, Stuart, we even had a frank chat about this at one stage, and I didn't put some resources into something he was suggesting then about that, precisely for that concern, because it can be treated so cynically. It was a little bit more with what happened in South Australia around the nuclear waste dump. It was actually plugged into the actual government processes and the like, and that was quite fascinating. I think we need to be encouraging that, and that's why I actually think the richer discussions around the corporate boardrooms and the realisation around fiduciary duties, which are longer term duties, and duties that are there to future shareholders, not just to current shareholders, are really important that we bring to the fore as well. So not just sort of citizens getting together, but very importantly, these companies, many of whom have got the resources of small countries, are actually thinking about that, and many of them are. And so I think that's something I'd want to do that. And there's a whole question that we've been very good of getting humans as accumulators of capital and being treated as consumers, but anything that can look to change out and have so we're more active citizens and that we're actually associations of people for a good purpose, and that, including making a profit, is a good thing.
Yeah.
So you'd give it a go, but be careful to see that it was properly packaged and presented and well resourced.
Well, it's got to be demonstrably linked into a decision-making process, in my view.
There's got to be something that arises from it. Governments feeling their way forward out of this. What about you, Rebecca?
Oh, I was actually on a very small board overseeing the South Australian nuclear facility, where I have a very well, I won't bore you about my very complex views about these forums, but one thing I have thought, and I've been interested about the extent to which local councils across Australia and the world have been declaring climate emergencies. And I think one of the opportunity beyond that, because it's obviously made at the council level, is to think about, well, what does that actually, to use these forums as an opportunity as a kind of follow-on from that. So if we've declared a climate emergency in the seat of Port Macquarie or whatever, the area of Port Macquarie, what does that mean for residents, for schools, for small business, for any stakeholder? That could potentially, if done well, reinforce just the fact that we've declared a climate emergency. And what I'm really hungry for is as many case studies of different parts of the community coming together to respond to climate in a way that makes people think people like me are doing something about it. And I think that could be a really kind of useful way forward.
Okay.
One of the things, Bob.
And when you finish, I'll be asking you for your questions.
Yeah.
John?
Well, I guess one of the ways I've been thinking about this lately as well, and with the absolute fact now that we are stuffed unless we actually start drawing this down out of the atmosphere, our ecological processes are going backwards, is actually get more into a repair narrative. I think sustainability, and I've poured blood out for it, and indeed carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, and I've poured blood out for that and said there's no such thing as a low carbon future, but there's no such thing as a net zero future either. So we've actually got to actively, at industrial and natural scales, pull it out of the atmosphere. So there's a repair narrative.
Yeah.
I've been experimenting with this a little bit. I'm not sure how you think.
No, it's really
this in fact is the greatest repair job in human history. And hopefully this is actually something that might appeal to those in the back sheds and working sheds. That this is about, we've got to get together and roll up our sleeves and get to work on that. And I think there's a variant on something I wrote in 2000 about the regeneration, which was actually about renewables and other bits there. But it's actually about repair. Yeah. And it's actually about response. You use that word as well. And I think we're all going to have to be more active in our fire brigades, our emergency services. It is a reality. Our summers are going to be responding to these crises as well. So I think there's something in a positive narrative there, but open to hearing.
There's something wonderful about that repair, protect combination, which is about self-sufficiency and which actually, as well as responsibility to some extent, which actually can appeal across the political spectrum. And it also taps into something which hasn't been as politicised as climate change, which is that people recognise that we don't have a kind of endless resources, that we have to find ways to use what we have. And it kind of can even reach back for Conservatives to the whole, my grandfather used to take a breeze block and a piece of twine and create a car, and we would drive on holidays. You know what I mean? That kind of thing, those kinds of stories about what the resilience and capability of previous generations to be able to sustain life with reusing things. So I love that repair. I think any words that don't sound jargonish to people, again, very, very much. And unfortunately, some of the things, sustainability, those ones as useful as they are for us, when we kind of think about the community, well, what does sustainability mean?
Also passive.
Yeah.
Okay, I want you to have, a question here. Introduce yourself and keep it to questions. We've got to get through a lot.
Yeah. Dr. Ian McGregor from here at UTS Business School. I'm looking forward to working with you on business and climate change, but I think you're over-optimistic. I think 45% will achieve in the electricity sector through the business initiatives because renewable energy prices are going low, energy efficiency is in the interest of business. But the two big other sectors, emissions, transport and agriculture, we're way behind. So we need strong sector initiatives in those areas because we're way from electric trucks, hydrogen-powered planes, etc., etc. So I think we need, probably do need a 45% economy-wide emission reduction target, but the big challenges are in transport and agriculture.
Yeah, well put. Challenges, transport and agriculture, and
I'm not sure 45%. It's a question, but
we've got to embrace that. Let's take that up too when we've got Professor Garneau here, because that's...
Okay. Yeah, I'd challenge Ross on that one as well, I've got to say. But but excited about things that can happen.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Over here, sir. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Dominic Case from a local community group, Climate Change Balmain Roselle. We've talked about the fact that more and more people are acknowledging that the climate is changing, that it is real. I think the next step is that people are saying, yes, it's real, but there's an awful lot of people who are saying, well, firstly, are we convinced it's human-caused, or is it volcanoes or the sun or men from Mars or whatever? And secondly, therefore, we can't do anything about it. Now, my question is, does the panel agree that that's a serious problem? And does that also mean that we are moving slightly from focusing on mitigation to preventing it from getting worse, the causes from getting worse, to adaptation, to dealing with the results in a sort of lie back and accept it sort of mode?
Yeah, so I'll give. So you often do. You have to measure not just if people think climate change is happening, but how much they think it's human caused, and also that if it's therefore human caused, it can be reversed by human action. So there's almost like 4 or 5 questions before you really get to the actual number of people who will be thinking about climate at all when they vote, for example. I think you can still find ways to convince the people who think that most of this climate change that we're seeing is natural. You can still convince them that we need to make significant changes in terms of how we use energy. You're just going to be using very different language with them. And I'll give you just a very small piece of information before we move on. And John would know this, one of the greatest penetrations of rooftop solar in the region is regional Queensland. So for whatever reason, they're prepared to pony up some money for solar panels in their own house, whether they sign up to climate change as an issue. So I think, again, it's about who are you talking to, what's going to convince them, and the language that you use. We require a much more targeted approach.
Question here.
Hello, my name's Hudson from a company called Precinct. My question is, and I was at high school when John Button was leading the deregulation of manufacturing in Australia. What lessons are there from the language that was used then? And was it different because it wasn't about the environment, so we could get everyone to agree, or because there were definitely losers there, whether it was the unions, incumbent industry? How was that accepted and led by a Labor Party when now we can't get another major structural reform through?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it was the Hawke government strikingly saying in the middle of the early 90s recession, no, we're going to go on reducing tariffs for the car industry with the support, I've got to be fair and non-partisan here, with the support of John Howard and Hewson and the coalition in opposition. So it was interesting. I suppose very quickly I'd say the impact was regional rather than across the whole economy. But I suppose just thinking out loud, the rest of the community could see that they were paying too much for cars. We were taxing the imports too heavily. They could see that. In other words, the theme you started with, you got to spell out the benefits. The benefits were cars coming down in real terms. And cars that were better for the environment than the shoddy, ramshackle local product. Paul Mills.
My name's Paul. I'm from New South Wales Young Labor. I just want to expand on the conversation around regional Queensland and the Hunter and coal miners' jobs. So I'm sure coal miners in the Hunter and regional Queensland are scared about their job security. But I'm sure they would want their children to have a better job than they had that has job security as well. So a bit of an open question, but what is the better job that we can guarantee their children in a green energy future? And is that a better job that will provide their children with long-term financial security?
It's a really good point. And is it a job that's actually going to be in that area or somewhere else? I think, and this is not something I know about the facts of. I mean, are we selling those communities a lie when we say that secure jobs in a renewable, in an economy with renewable energy is going to deliver them the kind of prosperity they either expect or have had in the past? I think there are cultural and social barriers to thinking that's the case. But are the facts on our side when we say, if you don't have the Adani mine, something else will come? And I'm taken back to a comment that was made by one of the party's qualitative researchers in Queensland, who's a friend of mine, who did all the groups leading up to the election in Townsville and all that area. And he said, look, Rebecca, it's not that people in groups didn't think that climate change was real or didn't think it was a problem. He said it wasn't a choice between jobs and climate change, it was a choice between something and nothing. They think they've been left out, they've been lost, they didn't really understand that Labor had a package of other kinds of jobs for them, and they've been sold lies about prosperity in the economy in the past. They're not necessarily going to buy this new line. So it's really tricky. So I actually don't know, are those jobs there for them? And as we know, sometimes people don't always listen to facts. And they don't always believe the thing that's promised down the line.
Well, as he put it, it's not what you say, it's what they hear.
That's what they hear, yeah.
And there's sometimes a gap.
Yeah, look, I think it's a very real question, and I talk with the unions about this, and it is a fact. And there are people working 180 grand a year in those mines, and you don't get that for assembling solar panels. If you think of a broader ecosystem of the economy and more resilience for the changes, that's what you've got to start to talk to, but actually have a clear package about that transition. And I think perhaps one of the big challenges that Labor faced in the last election was straddling the barbed wire fence, left them in a very uncomfortable position, trying to communicate one thing in Queensland and another thing back in metropolitan Victoria.
Yeah.
The other thing, because we kind of get on it and talk about it in different contexts, that urban versus metro. Because there was a story recently on the news and it was about water and the restriction level. And I think at that point, the urban level was lower than the regional level. And I was I had a little panic moment because I thought, is this going to become a real urban metro issue as well? Because of how sometimes it does get reported and it wasn't critical at that time. It might be critical now, but it wasn't critical at the time, but it was in regional areas. And so then there's that divide again?
The divide's there all the time. Inner
Yeah.
city, outer metropolitan, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and then regional, rural. So, and even regional areas I'd classify in kind of 5 different categories as well. So there's quite a lot of place-based resentment broadly around the economy and around government services, and then you fold environmental questions into there, and it's a whole other ballgame. And again, part of it is about how we get around that as we talk about, we don't talk about, we try and find a way not to talk about what other people in other parts of a city are doing. It's like, what are you doing in your local community? And really trying to focus as much as you can on those kind of local questions and building it up as much as you can. Ooh, somebody's been waiting. Yeah. Awesome.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm a student here who kind of helped organise some of the climate strike stuff on campus, and I guess something that we've been really pushing in terms of that whole idea of a just transition is that it should be publicly funded, and so that means that, like, we can actually have that direct effort of like public investment being made to actually bring about that change. I guess like learning from history, like the market mechanisms have continuously failed and really let us down and led us to actually be here at the moment in terms of addressing climate change. And so I think the appeal to big business isn't as helpful as we it isn't really the path forward. So I guess my question is, when given the choice between trying to actually support everyday people and workers on the ground and trying to connect with them in their language, they're just workers who want to have a nice safe home and pay their power bills, and they don't want that cost put on them if they want, a safe, secure future. In terms of relating to those people, like, how do we prioritise and do that instead of trying to get the, appeal to the moral conscience of like Mossman dads or something? Like, how do we get to my mum and dad of Penrith? Like, that's who I want on side, and I think they should have like a way forward. So yeah, what kind of language or what sort of things can we do to make sure we have that broad pace support on the ground?
I wouldn't be so. I understand that you've made the point that market mechanisms have failed. I think that, and again, I defer to John to this, but I think we're at a point where there is no one path, and there is literally not a part of society that hasn't got to put their shoulder to the wheel about this. So the idea that it's only going to be through government action that we're going to do something around is probably, perhaps that would have been the case maybe 20 years ago, or maybe just one sector could shoulder that burden. Everybody's got to do something. So I don't think it's an either-or question. I think it's everybody, and it's actually only if it's going to be everybody is that going to be effective. Because one of the problems, the issues we have, and the issues that the significant percentage of LNP voters in Australia who worry about climate change is that one of their triggers is the idea that action on climate change is going to radically reorient our society and change the way that government works in terms of the private sector. It's easy when you're on the progressive side of politics and you want massive structural change to bring about greater social justice, that there are people who don't want that. So in order for you to act on climate change, you have to accept that there's going to be a lot more government regulation, and a complete refashioning of power relations is one way to get them to turn off. So what I'm trying to say is the only way we deal with this is different kinds of people talking about the different kinds of things they do in different kinds of language. So there is no one path. And the more that you present one path towards a solution, the greater it is for people to turn away. At the most extreme, you've got deniers who say that climate change is made up by left-wing organisations that have infiltrated the CSIRO and whatever. No, don't laugh. That's the things they say to me. In order to bring about a massive restructuring of society and a communist regime, a global communist regime. Don't laugh, we know that that's what they think. So one of the things we
You're
have...
saying that view is a
out there.
statistically significant part of the attitude of
Yeah.
conservative Australia to climate.
So there are, you know, in the segmentations that have been done at Yale and the ones that have been done here, there are two kind of groups of Australians. There were people who you would say are deniers and people who you would say are doubtful. And it's often quite difficult to tell the difference between somebody who's really doubtful about the science of climate change and a denier. The difference between somebody who's doubtful and a denier is a denier actually thinks that this is a lie that's being made up in order to bring about another political agenda, right? It's a kind of conspiracy theory, and it's infiltrated into the way. Now, I think deniers, really hardcore deniers, should just be forced out of Parliament and ignored. But the doubtful who are conservative and actually look around and think there isn't actually that much wrong with our society, they don't want massive structural change, but are concerned about climate. My concern is that if we really want to find a way to get them to be concerned about climate and acting on it, we have to find different ways. We need 100 paths to the same future.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Lucy Buxton from the Climate Change Cluster at UTS. Following on from your point, Rebecca, the language of climate change often includes the statement, I believe in climate change, I don't believe in climate change. And that word is intrinsically polarizing. So do you think that this has changed or is changing? And how can we move past that type of vocabulary?
John?
Well, it must change, but it is still a pretty key feature, and you still hear it a lot. And it's fascinating because it does mean that lets people fall back into their ideological and tribal sets of frames and narratives and all those things. And so, and amongst the things that Greta has done, Greta and David Attenborough, I should add, by the way, has actually just held the mirror up on the facts. It's not me about me, she's done so brilliantly, to the infuriation of some over 55-year-old white males, is to say, don't listen to me, this is the IPCC. So I think we have to get around that, but and I think we should challenge that. When you hear that word belief, people call on people to mount crusades against this for the truth or whatever. For goodness sake, I was going to say for Christ's sake, for goodness sake, let's not get into that.
Oh, there's fascinating. There's quite a lot of work being done on the language of religion and this kind of idea of climate change being a religion. I'm always fascinated by right-wing columnists attack climate believers, but don't attack traditional believers. But they also don't listen to the religious leaders all around the world, including evangelicals in America who take climate change seriously. So there's a bit of cherry picking in the conservative press about when we listen to religious leaders on important social issues and don't.
Just a thought, but let's be very specific. How much of it is driven by a News Limited agenda?
An enormous amount is driven by a News Limited agenda. What News Limited and people like Alan Jones do is they make people think that more people question climate change than actually do, and whether that be the scientific evidence or not. And consistently, in places like Australia where this is a particular issue, right? Canada, America, England, Australia. You go to other countries and they actually don't have this as badly as we have, and that's a News Limited and associated media. Is that when you ask people how many people in your community do you think deny climate change, they massively overestimate it. They put it at 20, 30%. And it's not. Most surveys show that really hardcore deniers are somewhere between 10 and 15%. People who don't think it's happening, think it's all basically a lie. So I think that, again, it's about who are you talking to. For some people, the word belief is going to make you think that you're standing on a corner with a kind of end of a world is nigh, handing out flyers, and generally somebody you try and ignore. For other people, you can say, is it something you accept? Is it something, thinking about different ways to talk about it. Again, you're thinking about the person in front of me in the group I'm trying to talk to, how are they presenting to this issue? What's their worldview? I do think and this has been, it's politically polarised, but it's also becoming socially polarising. I have a friend who lives in Washington, she works for the government, and she said it's actually very common when you're on dating sites in Washington and kind of in the area that you have to declare whether you voted for Trump and believe in climate change. It's actually quite critical about whether you will date somebody or sleep with them. And if you find out, she said, I'm kind of have to have the combination of didn't vote for Trump and believes in climate change. I'm prepared to kind of come up with somebody who thinks doubtful about climate change, but she won't sleep with anybody who voted for Donald Trump. And I think that we should encourage that behaviour, really.
Now we're talking the language.
Okay. You did well, though, because when the Climate Institute was established, your big philanthropic contribution came from one branch of the Murdoch family.
Yes, indeed. It used to be one of my great dinner stories that we were funded by the Murdoch family. It was when Rupert Murdoch created News Corp, because he bought out the family. And it was his sister and their children who are and have been active in the arts and philanthropy, and his nephew Tom passed away, and so that family was trying to work out how they use his estate. And so they, back in 2005, said that fresh voice was needed to try and inject some change, and they gave us 5 years funding, and we managed to stay around for over 12 years, I think.
Yeah, you did very well. We'll take one more question.
So I'm Nicole Hayne from Macquarie University, and when Australia transitioned out of car manufacturing and when it ceased in the early 2000s, we had massive job losses, especially in regional areas. This time around, when we expect to have these job losses again, when we move away from a carbon economy, and especially in mining in regional areas, what sort of specific policies can state and federal governments do to, first of all, retrain these affected workers, then second of all, find them alternative employment?
So there are things that can be done, and I think there are actually, I think there's some rational things that have come into some of the energy discussions about having a 3 or 5 year period advance notice. We've looked in the La Trobe where there's been some efforts. I mean, the unions wanted something stronger to actually have a statutory authority that can say, okay, let's give a package for those who are at the retirement end of the spectrum and help them out with money. But can we, if there are younger workers there in X power plant, can we shift them across to other power plants? So there are managed ways which we can do that. We've done this in other areas, not very well, in fisheries, in native forests, in water. Some of that's not been fantastic, but it's not been all bad either. So it's actually, there are a set of, it needs dedication and focus, and we can, but the policies can be there to aid that transition and to avoid the disruption.
I think taking that up, there are 3 initiatives, Stuart, you and I might explore for future public events out of this discussion. One would be the transition issue. Where are the new jobs coming from? How do you get a discussion with affected communities about them? So talking to Unions New South Wales about something we can do with them might provide some pointers. And Mark Murray, the Secretary of Unions New South Wales, might be a good person to guide us and to be in a panel. He's consulting members. That's one initiative. A second initiative could be what works with conservative inclined Australians. And there's some international experience. A former US congressman talking about a carbon tax with all the benefits going back to the people. Other people on the conservative side of politics internationally who might have their views summarised if we can't get them in by video conference at least. How does this rate? How does it count with people with a distinct conservative view of society? And the third one might be experience some of the organisations here have with language. So you, sir, from Rozelle and Balmain, mobilising a community. Chris Gambian from the Nature Conservation Council with its great diversity of action groups, environmental groups. it might be worthwhile to explore some case studies in how communities are mobilised. There are 3 initiatives I just want to put out there. Before I ask Stuart to thank our participants, what stands out for me from our discussion has been the agreement, embracing Rebecca and John, on talking about the benefits of moving beyond carbon. The difficulty of talking about climate when people are distracted by single-use plastic bags, of all things. The notion of the inevitable policy response initiative, so that the things that are going to happen to our society, to our economy, to business, are properly acknowledged, and you've got boards making decisions because they can see this on the horizon. It will be a disaster and there will be hurried responses, and they're going to be very bad. Better to address things now. And new ways, new conversations, Rebecca's emphasised that, and also John's notion of getting a conversation going about repairing and protecting and responding. Repairing and responding. Surely you can get agreement across the board on that approach to what The Economist magazine several years ago referred to as humankind's most reckless experiment. That is global warming.
Yeah.
I'll call on Stuart, but just a quick advertisement for 2 vital functions coming up, putting you under a bit of pressure because they're both in the 1 week, Tuesday the 19th of November. Martin Parkinson, former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, being interviewed by Marion Wilkinson, former Four Corners journalist, and the author of a forthcoming book on climate policy. She'll be asking him questions about how you design a climate scheme. So that's high priority. That is talking to someone who's been at the very forefront of putting together policy in Australia. I invite you all to come to that. But that proceeds by 2 days, Ross Garneau talking about his new book, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity. An opportunity to test him on his notion that we can get to that 46% reduction by 2030, which I think everyone said is very optimistic. But he's the preeminent economist in this field. His recent lectures at Melbourne University are worth looking at if you've got an inclination to explore the economics of climate. But big events here, UTS for Climate, coming up in November. Thanks to all of you for being here. Stuart.
Thanks very much, Bob, and I certainly agree that those 3 areas, those 3 initiatives are 3 that we should take forward, and they extend very nicely some of the work that's already being done at UTS, so I think we'll definitely look into that either through events or through research projects. So I think you'll agree with me, we've had an incredibly rich and rewarding set of insights from our panellists and from Bob. No surprise, given the talent and experience that they represent, and I'd really like to commend Rebecca and John, not just for coming today, I'd really like to thank you for that, but also just for your commitment to these issues and taking them out into the public realm and over many years. So thank you for that as well. Now we do have a gift for our guest speakers, which we'd like to provide to you. It's a memento of UTS, indeed one of our newest, features one of our newest buildings, the only Gehry designed building in Sydney, in Australia, and it's a gift for you as a way of thanks for your time and for your contribution.
I won't kiss you.
Oh, no.
And thanks as always to Bob for his contributions and for indeed being the trigger for this event and indeed the 2 events coming up. You're a great asset to UTS, Bob, and we will keep using that asset in the interest of climate change. So thank you. And thanks, of course, to our colleagues from Marketing Communication, from AV Services and from ISF for all of the help behind the scenes. And thanks so much to you for coming on a Friday afternoon to hear about this important issue. And please feel free to stay for some refreshments, have a look at the posters, take a flyer for the 2 events, and travel safely home. Cheers. Cheers.